1022 a.m. June 4, 1942. Aboard the flight deck of the IJN Akagi, cutting through the vast Pacific 325 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll, the air thrummed with the violent symphony of war. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga gripped his flight roster, his hands still trembling, not from fear, but from the raw adrenaline of his bombing run over the American island. Through the bridge windows, he watched the controlled chaos below, a perfectly executed dance of death. Dive bombers were being shoved aside for torpedo planes, their silverfish swapped for massive land attack bombs. Fuel hoses slithered across the steel deck like metallic serpents, pumping life into the machines that would deliver the final blow. Tucked away in his pocket, a letter to his wife remained unfinished, its last line, a testament to the supreme confidence of an empire at its peak. The Americans are nowhere to be found. Victory is certain. He could not know. He could not possibly fathom that at this exact moment a storm of American aircraft was already screaming out of the empty sky, converging on his position with righteous fury. He could not know that the fate of 4 of the world's most powerful warships, the entire trajectory of the Pacific War, and the very soul of the Japanese Empire would be decided in the next 11 minutes, less time than it takes to drink a cup of tea. How did absolute certainty turn into catastrophic ruin? What single mistake sealed their doom? To witness the moment where everything changed, make sure you follow our channel, like this video, and share it with anyone who loves history. The story of the 11 minutes that shattered an empire begins now. Lieutenant Tominaga's unwavering belief in victory was not his alone. It was a sacred doctrine etched into the very soul of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For 6 months, they had been the vengeful gods of the Pacific, an unstoppable force of steel and fire that had laid waste to everything in its path. From the shattered paradise of Pearl Harbor to the sun-scorched ports of Darwin, from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea, they had known nothing but absolute crushing victory. Their confidence was not merely arrogance. It was a fortress built upon a foundation of unparalleled success, a testament to what they believed was their martial and spiritual superiority. They saw themselves as the masters of a new age of naval warfare, one they had pioneered and perfected. They believed they knew everything, every weakness of their enemy, every strength of their own, every possible outcome of the battle to come. But the chilling truth hiding in the boundless blue expanse of the Pacific was that they did not know the one thing that mattered most. They were sailing into the jaws of a perfectly laid trap, utterly and completely blind. This blindness was born of an invincibility complex that had been earned in blood and fire. The Kido Butai, the striking force of 4 fleet carriers commanded by Admiral Nagumo, was the most powerful naval weapon ever assembled in human history. It was the sharp point of the samurai sword wielded by the most experienced naval aviators on the planet. These were not mere pilots. They were veterans, masters of their craft, who had sunk more Allied warships in half a year than the Imperial Navy had destroyed in all its previous wars combined. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter so advanced it seemed untouchable, a legend that carved fear into the hearts of Allied pilots. Opposite them stood what they perceived as a broken and demoralized American Navy. In his war diary, Captain Aoki of the carrier Akagi had chillingly summarized the prevailing sentiment. The American Navy is a broken force. After today, they will have no carriers in the Pacific. The war will effectively be over. This was not bravado. It was a statement of perceived fact. They had faced American carriers before at the Coral Sea and had sent the massive USS Lexington to the bottom of the ocean. They believed the Americans were predictable, cautious, and still reeling from the shock of Pearl Harbor. Their entire operational plan for Midway was predicated on this single fatal assumption that the enemy would react exactly as they expected. But while the decks of the Japanese carriers thundered with the roar of engines, a different kind of war was being waged in absolute silence in a windowless basement in Hawaii. This was Station Hypo, the nerve center of American cryptanalysis, and it was here that the Japanese fortress of confidence was being dismantled piece by painstaking piece. For months, a team of brilliant obsessive codebreakers led by Commander Joseph Rochefort had been locked in a desperate intellectual struggle with the Japanese Navy's most secure operational code, JN-25. It was a maddeningly complex system, but through a combination of genius intuition and sheer force of will, they had cracked it open. The result was nothing short of a miracle. As Japanese commanders planned their operations in supreme secrecy, Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was reading their mail. He knew their target was the tiny atoll of Midway. He knew the composition of Nagumo's force down to the last ship. He knew their routes, their timetables, their entire grand strategy. The Japanese believed they were the hunters preparing to lure the remnants of the American fleet to their doom. The reality was that they were the prey steaming blindly towards an ambush point designated by Nimitz with the darkly optimistic name Point Luck. Every assumption the Japanese held about their operational security was a lie. They were performing for an audience that already knew the script, and the final act was destined to be a tragedy. This informational blindness was compounded by a profound underestimation of American will and ingenuity. Japanese naval intelligence had correctly confirmed that the carrier USS Yorktown had been heavily damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month prior. Their expert analysis, based on their own shipyard capabilities, concluded that she would require a minimum of 3 months of repairs to be made battle-worthy again. This assessment was logical sound and completely wrong. It was a failure not of analysis but of imagination. The Japanese High Command could not conceive of what was happening at that very moment in the dry docks of Pearl Harbor. They could not envision 1,400 American workers, welders, electricians, shipfitters swarming over the crippled carrier like ants working around the clock in a frenzied, desperate race against time. They performed 3 months of repairs in 3 days. Welders worked continuously, even as the ship was being provisioned. Her flight elevators were being fixed while she sailed out of the harbor. This resurrection was an industrial and logistical feat, so monumental that it existed outside the realm of possibility for the Japanese. Their confidence was reinforced by their own intelligence reports, which told them a truth that was no longer true. They sailed towards Midway, absolutely certain they would face at most 2 enemy carriers. The presence of the ghost ship Yorktown would be a brutal, decisive surprise that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of the battle to come. This systemic arrogance and informational blindness inevitably began to manifest as tactical errors on the battlefield long before the first bomb fell. Standard Japanese naval doctrine, honed through years of training, called for a vast, multi-layered reconnaissance screen to be launched ahead of the main carrier force. Dozens of scout planes were meant to sweep wide arcs of the ocean, ensuring no enemy fleet could approach undetected. But on the morning of June 4th, Admiral Nagumo, supremely confident that no American ships were in the vicinity, and eager to preserve his best aircraft for the glorious strike on Midway itself, made a critical compromise. Instead of a dense screen, he authorized the launch of only 7 scout planes, creating vast, unsearched gaps in the ocean between them. It was a small act of hubris, a minor deviation from doctrine, but it was the first crack in the foundation of their perfect plan. Then fate intervened. Of the 7 planes launched, the one assigned to the most critical search line, Sector 4. The area to the northeast from where an American force would most likely appear was aboard the heavy cruiser Tone. At 4:30 a.m., as the other scouts were being flung into the pre-dawn sky, the catapult on the Tone malfunctioned. A full 30 minutes passed before the issue was resolved, and its float plane was finally launched into the air. 30 minutes. In the silent, unforgiving calculus of war, it was an eternity. This single mundane mechanical failure on a secondary vessel would have more impact on the course of the battle than any single act of heroism or strategic brilliance. That 30-minute delay would place the Tone's scout plane directly over the American carrier fleet at the worst possible moment for Admiral Nagumo, the precise window when his own flight decks would be crowded with vulnerable, fully fueled and armed aircraft. The chain of cause and effect set in motion by a faulty catapult was leading directly to disaster. The Japanese Navy, blinded by their arrogance and crippled by an intelligence failure they couldn't comprehend, was now flying on instruments of pure assumption, unaware that a single 30-minute delay was about to steer them into the heart of a perfect storm. Their invincibility was an illusion, and the dawn that promised another glorious victory was about to become the twilight of their empire. The catastrophic blindness that afflicted the Japanese High Command was not a passive condition. It was an active, corrosive force that began to warp operational reality long before the first American plane was sighted. This deep-seated conviction of superiority, built on the flawed intelligence and cultural assumptions detailed in their planning, now descended from the strategic level to the tactical, infecting the very mind of Admiral Chuichi. Nagumo. On the bridge of the Akagi, he was a man caught in a storm of his own making, steering his fleet by the light of false stars. The initial strike on Midway had gone exactly as planned, a testament to the skill of his aviators. But the resistance had been fiercer than anticipated. American fighters, though obsolete, had risen to meet them, and the anti-aircraft fire from the island was dangerously accurate. Then, at 7:00 a.m., the first domino tipped. A message arrived from the strike leader, Lieutenant Tomonaga, the same man whose confidence had seemed so absolute just hours before. His report was terse and fateful. There is need for a second attack wave. This message placed Nagumo on the horns of a terrible dilemma, though he did not yet recognize its true shape. His doctrine was clear. He had held a massive second wave of 93 aircraft in reserve, a sledgehammer poised and ready. Half were torpedo bombers armed with deadly Type 91 torpedoes, specifically for engaging enemy warships. The other half were dive bombers armed with armor-piercing bombs. This force was his ace in the hole, the guarantors of victory against any American fleet that dared to show itself. But his scout planes, the eyes of his fleet, remained stubbornly silent. The vast ocean to the northeast was, according to his reports, empty. Meanwhile, Midway, the known threat, was still active, still capable of launching its own aircraft. Ineffective attacks by B-17 seconds from the island had already begun, forcing his mighty carriers into evasive maneuvers. The logic filtered through the lens of supreme confidence seemed inescapable. Why hold a weapon in reserve for a ghost that may not exist when a living enemy was right in front of him? Pressured by his staff and swayed by Tomonaga's urgent request, Nagumo made the single most disastrous decision of his career. At 7:15 a.m., the order crackled across the fleet: remove torpedoes, load bombs for land attack. This was not merely a command, it was the starting pistol for a race against time that would transform the most powerful warships on Earth into floating munitions dumps, each with a lit fuse. The controlled chaos Lieutenant Tomonaga had witnessed from the bridge now descended into the fiery steel-clad bowels of the carriers. The process was a mechanic's nightmare. Each torpedo-laden Kate bomber had to be lowered from the flight deck into the crowded hangar below. Their armourers swarmed the aircraft, working with frantic haste. The 1,800-pound torpedoes had to be carefully unmounted from their specialized racks using heavy carriages. Then the 800-kilogram land attack bombs, requiring entirely different attachment points and release mechanisms, had to be hoisted into place. There was no time to follow safety protocols. The massive torpedoes, instead of being returned to the heavily armoured magazines deep within the ship, were simply rolled to the side of the hangar deck and stacked like cordwood. Fuel hoses crisscrossed the floors, refueling aircraft. Even as ordnance was being changed, a practice strictly forbidden but deemed necessary to save precious minutes. The hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu became scenes of organized desperation, filled with the clang of steel, the shouts of men, and the volatile fumes of aviation fuel, surrounded by enough high explosives to level a city. And it was into this maelstrom of vulnerability that the first whisper of truth arrived. At 7:08 a.m., the delayed scout plane from the cruiser, Tone, now 30 minutes behind schedule, finally reached its search area. Its pilot, Petty Officer Amari, spotted something on the horizon. His radioed report, received on the Akagi's bridge at 7:40 a.m., was maddeningly vague. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface ships. Nagumo was frozen. 10 ships could be anything: transports, destroyers, a logistical convoy. It was not the decisive threat that would justify halting the complex rearming operation. He continued the chaos below decks while snapping back an order to the scout: ascertain ship types and maintain contact. For 15 agonizing minutes, the Japanese fleet continued to turn itself inside out, while the truth lingered just over the horizon. Then, at 7:55 a.m., a second message arrived and a wave of dangerous relief washed over the bridge. Enemy ships are 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. A collective sigh. cruisers and destroyers. No carriers. The decision to rearm for the land attack now seemed not just correct but prescient. Some of Nagumo's staff officers even celebrated. Catching an American surface force without air cover would be a turkey shoot, a glorious warm-up for the main event. The frantic work below decks continued with renewed purpose. They had been right all along. The Americans were fools. The relief lasted exactly 14 minutes. At 8:09 a.m., a third message tore through the calm on the bridge, a message that corrected the previous report and shattered their world. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be one carrier bringing up the rear. The atmosphere on the bridge of the Akagi erupted. A carrier, even one carrier, changed everything. The ghost was real. In a heartbeat, Nagumo issued a flurry of new desperate orders. Suspend rearming. Leave torpedoes on aircraft that still have them. Prepare to launch ship attack immediately. But he had already crossed the point of no return. His command, which once held the power of life and death over the entire Pacific, was now utterly impotent. The situation below decks had passed a critical threshold of chaos, from which there was no quick recovery. Half of his torpedo bombers now had land attack bombs attached but not fused. Others still had their torpedoes partially mounted, or were surrounded by the tools and carriages needed to remove them. Some planes were on the flight deck armed with the wrong weapons. Others were in the hangar, trapped behind planes armed with different ones. To launch a coordinated, effective strike, all aircraft needed to be armed the same way. It would take at a minimum another 45 minutes to an hour to either complete the conversion to bombs or reverse the entire agonizing process back to torpedoes. As this horrifying reality dawned on the Japanese command, a new crisis screamed toward them. The Midway Strike Force, the very planes that had started this domino effect, were now returning. They were low on fuel, riddled with bullet holes, and their pilots were exhausted. They needed to land immediately. Naval doctrine was absolute and unforgiving: you recover your aircraft first. To leave them circling until they ran out of fuel would be to sacrifice dozens of veteran pilots, the irreplaceable heart of the Imperial Navy. Nagumo was trapped, caught between his own flawed decisions, the ironclad rules of naval doctrine, and the sudden terrifying appearance of an enemy he had believed was not there. At 8:30 a.m., he made his second fatal decision, the only one he felt he could make. Recover the Midway Strike Force first, then we will deal with the American carrier. The order was given. The flight decks of the mightiest warships on the planet were cleared, not for a launch that could save them, but for a recovery operation that would doom them. The dominoes set in motion by a single miscalculation an hour earlier had all fallen. The Japanese carriers, their decks cluttered, their hangars filled with exposed ordnance, their combat air patrol out of position, were now perfectly catastrophically vulnerable. The trap which they had unknowingly helped the Americans to set was about to spring. While Admiral Nagumo's fleet was ensnared in a web of its own creation, a paralyzing cycle of recovery and rearmament born from flawed intelligence, a different kind of storm was gathering over the horizon. 300 miles to the northeast, the American fleet, the ghost that had haunted Nagumo's decisions, was very much real, and it was preparing to unleash hell. But this was not the confident, all-powerful force of Japanese imagination. This was a fleet running on borrowed time, patched-together hope, and raw, unadulterated grit. It was a fleet of underdogs, a collection of green pilots flying obsolete machines, led by men who knew they were gambling with the fate of the free world. And they were about to make the most desperate bet in the history of naval warfare. The chasm in quality and experience between the two forces was staggering. The Japanese aviators were the undisputed samurai of the skies, veterans of a 6-month campaign of conquest that had left a trail of burning ships and shattered enemies in their wake. They were a brotherhood of the elite, confident, battle-hardened, and flying the finest naval aircraft in the world. On the American flight decks, the reality was starkly different. Here stood boys, not hardened men, many of whom had never seen a Zippo lit in anger, let alone the muzzle flash of an enemy cannon. Many had fewer than 300 hours of total flight time. They were brave, they were determined, but they were overwhelmingly outclassed. Their machines mirrored their inexperience. While the Japanese Zero fighter was a legend of speed and agility, the American Wildcat was a brawler, slower and less nimble. But the true disparity, the one that filled the hearts of the American pilots with a cold dread, was the torpedo bomber. The Japanese Kate was a superb weapon, fast and effective. The American TBD Devastator was a flying coffin. It was a tragically misnamed aircraft, slow, unwieldy, and so poorly armed that its single rear-facing machine gun was next to useless. To fly a Devastator against the massed anti-aircraft fire of the WWII and its swarm of Zero fighters was not just a mission, it was a suicide pact. The pilots knew it. The admirals knew it. Their only real hope lay in the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, a rugged and reliable plane that could, if given the chance, deliver a decisive blow. But getting that chance would require a miracle paid for in the blood of their comrades. At the heart of this desperate enterprise was a man who was not a carrier aviator at all. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance was a cruiser man, a quiet, calculating strategist who had been thrust into command of Task Force 16 after Admiral Halsey was sidelined with a severe skin infection. Where Halsey was an inspirational, aggressive brawler, Spruance was an intellectual, a chess player. And as the reports from his scout planes began to trickle in, confirming the location of the Japanese fleet, he saw the entire chessboard laid out before him. His staff, including his air operations officer, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, argued for the conventional textbook approach. Wait, close the distance, coordinate the strike, launch a perfectly balanced package of fighters, dive bombers and torpedo bombers that could arrive over the target simultaneously, overwhelming the defenses. It was the smart play. It was the safe play. It was the play that would lose the battle. Spruance, in a moment of cold, brilliant intuition, understood a truth that transcended doctrine. He understood the concept of the vulnerable window. He knew, based on the timing of the Midway attack, that Nagumo's carriers were almost certainly in the process of recovering their aircraft. They would be unable to maneuver, their flight decks would be fouled, and their combat air patrol would be low on fuel and ammunition. A perfectly coordinated strike launched an hour from now would be met by a perfectly prepared defense. An imperfect, chaotic strike launched right now might just catch the enemy at the precise moment of maximum helplessness. The risk was enormous. Launching at extreme range meant many of his planes, especially the fuel-guzzling fighters, might not make it back. But the potential reward was incalculable. His response to his staff's protests was prophetic, a single sentence that would define the turning point of the war. We may lose planes, but if we catch them recovering their midway strike, we'll catch them at their most vulnerable, at 702 a.m. Spruance gave the order that sealed the fate of the Japanese fleet. Launch everything. Immediately. What followed was not the elegant clockwork precision of a Japanese launch. It was barely controlled chaos. Engines sputtered to life. Men shouted. Planes were pushed into position and flung off the decks of the Enterprise Hornet and the resurrected Yorktown as fast as humanly possible. There was no time to wait, no time to form up. Each squadron launched as soon as it was ready and proceeded independently towards the enemy's last known position. Fighters flew off in one direction, dive bombers in another. Radio discipline collapsed into a cacophony of confused voices. Navigation errors sent entire squadrons veering off into the empty ocean. Nowhere was the sense of impending doom more palpable than in the ready rooms of the torpedo squadrons. On the USS Hornet, Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron gathered the men of Torpedo Squadron 8VT8. He was an intense, almost mystical figure, a brilliant navigator who had dedicated his life to this single moment. He looked into the young faces of his pilots and gunners and spoke with a chilling certainty. "We're going alone," he told them, his voice steady. "We'll probably all be killed. But we're going to hit those carriers." It was not a speech meant to inspire hope. It was a statement of purpose. They were the sacrificial lambs. They were flying to their deaths, and they knew it. Their job was not to survive. Their job was to draw the enemy's fire, to pull the deadly Zero fighters down to sea level, to force the Japanese carriers into violent, evasive turns, so that someone else, the dive bombers they hoped were somewhere high above, could get a dive-clear shot. As Waldron's obsolete Devastators lumbered off the flight deck, followed by the torpedo squadrons from the other carriers, they became the embodiment of America's desperate gamble. They were a thin, fragile line of courage, flying low and slow into the heart of the most powerful fleet on Earth, armed with little more than the conviction that their sacrifice would pave the way for a victory they would never live to see. The entire hope of the Pacific War now rested on the wings of these doomed machines. The desperate gamble launched from the decks of the American carriers now flew low and slow across the water, a fragile procession of courage and outdated machinery heading directly into the heart of the Japanese fleet. At the vanguard was Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by the indomitable John Waldron. Through sheer navigational genius and an unshakable sense of destiny, he had found the Kido Butai. At 9:18 a.m., just as the last Japanese aircraft from the Midway strike was being recovered, lookouts on the carrier, Soryu screamed a warning. Incoming aircraft low on the horizon. On the Japanese bridges, the initial alarm quickly morphed into something resembling contemptuous pity. What was this? A handful of obsolete torpedo bombers lumbering towards them without a single fighter for protection. It was an insult. It was a joke. The combat air patrol, a swarm of deadly Zeros that had been circling high above, descended like hawks upon a flock of pigeons. The slaughter was immediate, brutal, and absolute. The sky erupted in a maelstrom of machine gun fire and cannon shells. The slow-moving devastators were torn to pieces, their wings shredded, their engines exploding in greasy balls of black smoke. One by one they cartwheeled into the sea, leaving behind nothing but a fleeting splash and a spreading oil slick. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo and his staff watched the massacre unfold with a sense of grim satisfaction. This was the vaunted American Navy. This pathetic suicidal charge. Every one of their assumptions was being validated in real time. The Americans were amateurs, throwing away the lives of their men in pointless gestures. The Zeros were invincible, the guardians of the fleet sweeping the skies clean with casual efficiency. The carriers, under the expert command of their captains, began a series of sharp, evasive maneuvers, their wakes carving elegant white arcs into the blue Pacific. The few torpedoes that were launched were easily avoided. Not a single one struck home. In a matter of minutes, all 15 planes of VT-8 were gone. Of the 30 men who had flown into battle, only one Ensign George Gay would survive, clinging to a floating seat cushion, a horrified spectator to the drama yet to unfold. The Japanese celebration was premature, for the American sacrifice was not a singular event but a relentless staggered wave of doom. At 9:36 a.m., just as the Zeros were climbing back to regain altitude, a new threat appeared. It was VT-6 from the Enterprise, 14 more, devastators also without escort. The scene repeated itself with sickening precision. The Zeros, masters of their element, dove back down, their guns blazing. Again, the American bombers were ripped from the sky. 10 of the 14 were destroyed without scoring a single hit. Then, at 1:00 a.m., it was Yorktown's VT-3 12 more torpedo planes, this time with a handful of escorting Wildcats that were hopelessly outmatched. 10 more devastators were shot down. By 1:20 a.m., the assault was over. The last of the American torpedo bombers was either fleeing or sinking beneath the waves. The victory seemed total, undeniable. 35 of the 41 attacking torpedo planes had been annihilated. Not a single Japanese ship had been scratched. On the bridge of the Akagi, the tension finally broke. Nagumo allowed himself a moment of relaxation. His operations officer reported with triumphant confidence, "Sir, the last attack has been repelled. We can be ready to launch our own strike against the American carrier in 30 minutes. All aircraft are being armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs." Below decks, the frantic rearming that had been reversed was now being reversed again, but this time with the certainty of impending victory. The flight decks of all 4 carriers were packed with aircraft fueled, armed, their engines warming up. The moment of maximum vulnerability had passed, and the moment of righteous vengeance was at hand. But the sacrifice, seemingly so futile, had achieved something magnificent and terrible, something that no one on the Japanese bridges in their moment of supreme arrogance could see. This was the perfect sacrifice. The relentless low-level attacks had not been designed to sink ships. They had been designed to manipulate the very battlefield itself. Firstly, they had drawn the entire Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The Zeros, having feasted on the slow-moving bombers, were now low on fuel and ammunition, gasping for altitude far below where the true threat would come from. Secondly, the constant need to evade torpedoes had forced all 4 Japanese carriers into continuous violent turns. A carrier cannot launch aircraft while maneuvering. It must turn into the wind and hold a steady course. The suicidal charges had kept the Japanese decks locked down, unable to spot their own devastating counterstrike. And most critically, the attention of every single Japanese lookout, every gunner, every officer on the bridge was focused downwards. They were scanning the waves, watching the water for the telltale white wakes of incoming torpedoes. Their eyes were glued to the horizon, their anti-aircraft guns trained horizontally. No one was looking up. No one was scanning the high, empty cobalt sky. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had bought more than just time. It had bought a fatal moment of distraction. They had pulled the eyes of the enemy down to the sea, while high above in the silent, sun-drenched heavens death was preparing to descend. The stage had been set, the trap had been sprung, and the price paid in the lives of nearly 100 American airmen was about to be redeemed in a firestorm that would change the world. High above the carnage, in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was a man on the verge of failure. His 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from the USS Enterprise were flying on fumes. They had reached the calculated intercept point, but the ocean below was a vast, empty blue canvas. The Japanese fleet wasn't there. Radio discipline had broken down. Fuel gauges were dipping into the red, and the sickening reality was setting in. They had missed their chance. Standard procedure dictated they turn back now to save what planes and pilots they could. But McCluskey, driven by a warrior's intuition that transcended the manual, made a command decision. He had spotted the lone wake of a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing northeast at full speed. Why? It had to be rejoining its fleet. In that moment, McCluskey made the most important guess of the war. He banked his squadron and followed, at 10:22 a.m. Through a break in the clouds, he saw them. It was a sight of such staggering power and terrible beauty that it defied belief. 4 Japanese fleet carriers, their decks packed with aircraft turning into the wind as they prepared to launch the strike that would annihilate his own fleet. The sacrificial lambs, the men of the torpedo squadrons, had done their job. They had bought him this perfect, pristine, impossible moment. Pushing the stick forward, McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio, a calm command that unleashed the apocalypse. Attack. Attack immediately. From 14500 feet, 33 Dauntless dive bombers tipped over and began their terminal descent, the roar of their engines building into a terrifying, vengeful scream. On the bridges of the Japanese carriers, the first frantic shouts of enemy dive bombers were just being raised, but it was too late. The Zeros were at sea level miles away, still recovering from their turkey shoot. The anti-aircraft guns were aimed horizontally, useless against the vertical threat. The lookouts, their attention fixed on the waves, had failed to look up. In the space of 60 seconds, the hunters had become the hunted, and the gods of the Pacific were about to be cast down from their heaven. The first to feel the wrath was the massive carrier Kaga. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's squadron fell upon her like wolves. The carrier was turning majestically, her flight deck, a perfect canvas of Japanese naval power. Dozens of planes' wings folded, waiting for the launch order. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck near the forward elevator, but it was the second that proved fatal. It smashed directly into the bridge, killing Captain Okada and his entire command staff in a single thunderous instant. 2 more bombs rained down in quick succession, hitting amidships among the tightly packed, fully fueled aircraft. The result was not an explosion. It was a volcanic eruption. The bombs didn't just destroy their targets. They acted as a detonator for the entire ship. The chaos Nagumo had unleashed hours before now paid its terrible dividend. The fuel lines, the carelessly stacked bombs, the armed torpedoes, all of it cooked off in a catastrophic rolling chain reaction. The Kaga, a symbol of imperial might, was transformed into a floating pyre, an 80,000-ton inferno, from which there would be no escape. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best, leading Bombing Squadron 6, selected his target, the flagship Akagi. He watched the ship below its deck, a mirror image of the Kaga's fatal vulnerability. He pickled his bomb and pulled out of his dive. His single 1,000-pound bomb, a solitary instrument of fate, plunged downward. It struck the flight deck near the midship elevator, punching through the steel as if it were paper. It exploded deep within the ship, in the heart of the hangar deck. It detonated directly in the midst of the very torpedoes and bombs that had been so frantically removed and stacked against all safety regulations just an hour before. The effect was apocalyptic. The internal blast ripped through the hangar, igniting everything: fuel, oil, ordnance, and men. A secondary explosion blew the massive elevator completely out of its housing, sending it cartwheeling into the bridge structure. The flagship of the WWII, the nerve center of the most powerful naval force on the planet, was mortally wounded, its heart ripped out by a single perfectly placed bomb. As if orchestrated by a divine hand of vengeance, the dive bombers from the USS Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrived at the exact same moment. They had followed the smoke and chaos, and their target presented itself untouched: the carrier Soryu. 3 bombs delivered with surgical precision struck the smaller carrier in a perfect line down her flight deck. The first hit the forward hangar, the second detonated among the packed aircraft, and the third destroyed the rear elevator. The Soryu had a unique vulnerability. She carried extra aviation fuel in unprotected tanks along her hangar sides. These tanks ruptured instantly, unleashing a firestorm of such impossible intensity that it melted steel and incinerated men where they stood. At 10:31 a.m., as suddenly as it had begun, the American attack was over. The Dauntlesses, their bomb racks empty, were climbing for home, many running on the last dregs of their fuel. In just 11 minutes, 660 seconds, the strategic reality of the Pacific War had been irrevocably and completely reversed. On the bridge of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo stood in stunned catatonic silence as explosions rocked the ship beneath him. His operations officer screamed damage reports that seemed impossible. Flight deck destroyed. Hangar deck in flames. All aircraft lost. Steering control lost. Nagumo seemed paralyzed, unable to process the scale of the ruin. Captain Aoki, seeing the admiral frozen in the face of annihilation, grabbed him by the arm. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag," he shouted over the roar. "The ship is lost. On the cargo there was no one left to give orders." With the command staff obliterated in the first moments, the ship was a rudderless inferno, its crew trapped in steel compartments that were rapidly becoming ovens. On the Soryu dying the fastest, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to abandon his bridge. As the flames closed in, his final order, heard by the few survivors struggling in the water, was clear: "Save yourselves. I will remain with Soryu." He was last seen lashing himself to the helm, determined to be the soul of the ship he had lost. The impossible had happened. 3 of the 4 pride carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the instruments of conquest that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, had been transformed from the most powerful warships afloat into burning, drifting hulks. The invincible samurai had been disemboweled. The confident assumptions, the intricate plans, the very myth of Japanese superiority, all of it had been consumed by fire in the time it takes to brew a pot of tea. The war was not over, but the age of Japanese victory had just been violently, decisively, and permanently executed. In the aftermath of the inferno, the battle's final brutal acts played out. The lone surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu launched a valiant but doomed counterattack, crippling the Yorktown, before being inevitably found and sent to the bottom in a blaze of glory. The Yorktown herself, despite heroic damage control, would later be sunk by a submarine. But these were mere postscripts. The war's decisive chapter had already been written between 1022 and 1031 a.m. In those few minutes, Japan lost more than 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers. It lost the core of its veteran naval aviators, the architects of its 6-month Pacific conquest, and a generation of skilled mechanics who could never be replaced. More importantly, it lost its aura of invincibility. The 11-minute storm of American bombs didn't just sink ships. It sank a nation's belief in its manifest destiny and shifted the entire trajectory of human history. The tide of the Pacific War had turned instantly and irreversibly. This battle was a perfect storm of hubris, intelligence, and incredible sacrifice. But what do you think was the single most decisive factor? Was it the American codebreakers, Nagumo's fateful decision to rearm, or McCluskey's lucky guess? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story as incredible as we do, please like, share and subscribe for more deep dives into the moments that defined our world.